Welcome to Business Authority Radio, bringing you insights from today's thought leaders, professionals, and influencers. With your hosts, Neil Howe and Craig Williams.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Neil Howe, and today my special guest is Kim Wyatt. Now, she helps businesses achieve their solutions to their tax questions and other legal issues. So welcome to the show, Kim.
Hey, thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me on.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and Exall Wood, which is the company that you work for, and what kind of clients do you help there?
Yeah, well, we're in Dallas, Texas, but we can really help people depending on the issue across the U.S. So we primarily, I'm a tax attorney, right? Well, I'm talking to you about tax stuff today. But we help generally business clients, whether it's a small business with just a couple people and all the way up to middle market business, a few $100 million in revenue type clients. We can do, simple things like employment agreement, just really basic things, all the way up to really complex like M&A transactions and things like that.
Well, let's talk about some of the clients that you deal with mainly. What are the big problems that you help solve for them?
Well, generally, whenever somebody's buying or selling a company or forming a company, they always want to know which tax structure is best for them, right? They don't want to say, pick something, be locked into it, and end up paying a lot more taxes than they want. So that's something we help them with. We also do, in the case of the new tax legislation, looking at it and helping them figure out what it means to them. So those are the big things that we're working on right now.
Now, if somebody forms a company and you said be locked into it, is that something that they are locked into once they've formed that company, or can that be changed?
Well, that actually kind of depends, Neil. So generally, if you form it as let's back up. So one, anything can almost always be changed. It's just what are the consequences? Mm-hmm. If you form your company as a flow-through entity, we like to call those as partnerships or possibly an S corporation, or let's say you don't form one, you just go out and you start doing a business. We call those a sole proprietorship. You have more flexibility. If you form an entity that has the words corporation or an Inc. at the end of it, then oftentimes you're a little bit more locked in that if your company is profitable, if its value has increased, that if you want to get out of that corporate structure, that you have to pay what we like to say a toll charge, and pay some money to the IRS to then move to, let's say, more of the flow-through partnership LLC structure.
Well, the IRS definitely likes to take our money, and they'll take any chance that they can to do that. So, but who do you work with mostly? Obviously, small businesses, they really help run the country. There's millions of small business owners. Is that your primary client? Somebody that doesn't have, that big in-house tax attorney working for them? Or do you help these big companies?
Well, we do help big companies. Big to what I consider big, like personally, with a few $100 million in revenue. But we really look for companies that maybe don't have an in-house legal department at all. Or maybe they have one in-house general counsel and they're kind of managing all the legal issues for the company. And oftentimes that person, in my case, isn't a tax attorney. And so they can turn to us and we can help them navigate their tax issues along with, possibly their in-house accountants or their outside accountants, however they choose to do their kind of book tax accounting work.
Well, obviously it will be a luxury to have a tax and attorney in-house and be able to go to them anytime that you need something. But some of those small businesses don't have that. So how do you help them out? What kind of problems do they have? Is it just understanding the new tax bills and making sure that they're doing everything properly?
I would say normally, so there's two things. There's kind of what we were saying, like, so one, like on a transaction basis, whenever you do any transaction, whether you buy a company, whether you sell a company, there's always a tax aspect. You want to make sure that both sides, from a tax perspective, are looking at the transaction the same. Normally, those transactions, there's some reporting that goes to the IRS about values. If you're buying several assets, you want to make sure that you guys both agree on what each individual asset is worth, because that can affect how much tax you pay. And then with the new tax bill that was passed, we're starting to talk to our clients now, because clients that, maybe they've been partnerships or sole proprietorships, they may want to incorporate, which is something we never thought we would say. Generally, as we discussed a couple of minutes ago, a corporate structure is a little bit more, if you have a corporate, right? That's the new, what everybody's talking about. You're going to pay a 21% flat rate. You still get deductions for state and local business taxes. Generally, corporations, because they had a higher rate in the past, people didn't look at them. They're like, oh gosh, we're only a corporation if we're going to be publicly traded, right? Or if you just have some other business need, generally that's not a tax related issue. But now, there are reasons you might want to be a corporation. It's still slightly more expensive overall. But we have people that are looking at that. And similarly, we have clients, actually going to talk to one tomorrow, but they're in a corporate structure, and depending on their circumstances, they have one primary owner. Is it actually better with this new qualified business income deduction? You can get your taxes down to a possible 29.6 rate, where it would otherwise be 37%. Is it worth it for them to move out of the corporate structure and into more of a flow-through structure using a partnership or an LLC that's taxed as a partnership? Those are the kind of things we're doing.
So there's a lot of new discussions happening right now because of this new tax bill. So what would be the advantage of a small business owner, or a sole proprietor looking to go to a corporate structure? I know you said it's 21% tax, but what other advantages does a corporation give a small business owner?
Yeah. So we're having a big deductions for state and local taxes, that is now limited to $10,000. So if your company was paying a lot of state tax in a high tax state like New York, California, you guys may be more, you may have more of an advantage, for going into the corporate structure where you can take 100% of that deduction. There's also something that hasn't really meant a lot in the past, but if you sell qualified small business stock, and there's certain qualifications to meet this, and we don't want to go into too many taxi details, but if you actually incorporate and then later sell your business, there are some circumstances that gain can be tax-free. So, and you don't have that option in a flow-through structure. That's in a corporate structure only. So that's just something that we're all having to step back and take a look at, because it's a whole new world.
So what are some of the biggest benefits that you see from this new tax bill?
Well, I think the biggest benefits is, I think almost a large majority of the country is going to see at least some savings. They're going to take home a little bit more money, and everybody likes to hear that news. In some cases, I think if you are at a really high tax state, like New York, California, again, you may not see that, but for a lot of America, you're going to see a reduced tax rate. I think it's really great that the corporate rate is down to 21%. That puts us much more in line with most of the other countries in the world. And it just makes us a lot more marketable. They also got rid of the corporate AMT, which is good. I mean, it's just kind of another headache, another way to calculate tax where you may have to pay tax and it's not due. And then I'm really intrigued, and I think it's what we're going to spend a lot of time on, looking at this new pass-through deduction. So if you have that pass-through kind of business that we were talking about, whether it's a partnership, an LLC that's taxed as a partnership, a sole proprietorship, or an S corp, is that you can actually get a deduction that's the lesser of like 20% of your income from that, or 50% of your W-2 wages. And there's lots of technical rules about that all around that area, and we probably don't want to go into those. But for a lot of businesses, they're going to be able to lower their tax rate, really because they're creating jobs. And so that seems, at least from a public policy perspective, a good thing.
Well, that was certainly something that the president wanted to do, was to create more jobs. And, his thinking behind that was, if you can get the local businesses to have some money to pay people, that they will create more jobs, and we leave it up to them. But that's good news. I think that most people are going to see a reduction in their taxes. And even in states like California and New York, there sounds like there's some options to get it down to at least that 21% for the corporate situation, which is great. Now, you also help with litigation if businesses get into problems?
You know what? I don't really do so much of that myself. Our firm does. Mm-hmm. So our firm has a litigation group. And so that's why we like to be like a one-stop kind of, we're broad enough that we can be a one-stop shop for those companies that don't really have an in-house legal group. So we can handle litigation, we can handle corporate, we can handle some finance, some real estate, and your tax issues that go along with all of those.
So what do you feel are some of the biggest myths when it comes to paying the taxes or setting up the business? What does a small business owner, or maybe somebody that's just starting a business, believe that might not be true?
Oh my gosh. One, I think sometimes people think that you can just ignore taxes and their accountant can just figure it out. And that they think that everything that's in their head about all of the expenses they've had and everything like that they can just tell their, accountant and they'll get to deduct all that from their return. And that's not really how, you could try to do that, but most accountants won't really deal with that. You need to keep your receipts. If you're having like a business dinner, let's say, you need to make sure that you document the business purpose of that dinner, because that's actually a deduction that was limited now. You can still deduct business food and beverage, but you need to be really clear that it's for a business purpose and not for entertainment. Mm-hmm. And so it's really helpful to keep all that contemporaneous documentation, because it's going to be hard to recreate it, 9 months later when you go to talk to your accountant. And then, I think a lot of people just think that they can go, or they do, and you can just go start your own business without maybe having an LLC. But then you can get into situations where you're personally, like if you get in a dust up with somebody and, the litigators are called, you can get into situations where you can become personally liable. And so it's always good to have kind of a company running the actual business. And you can, in most states, you can set those up from anywhere from like $100 to $500. So in some cases, it's not really cheap, but it's good to have that.
So for those businesses that are sole proprietor and now there's a larger standard deduction that they're able to take, is it still important for them to keep all their receipts?
Absolutely. Because if you're a sole proprietor, you actually put all of your business income and expenses, and they call it on a Schedule C. So it's Schedule C of your Form 1040. And so that's where you put all of your receipts. And so you just always need to have those, right? Even if you're doing your taxes yourself, which there's a lot of great tax software out there. If you're, as long as things aren't too complicated, like a smart person who wants to put in the time can usually figure it out. It might take them a lot longer than an accountant though. So, the value of your time is something to be considered. But yes, the IRS can always randomly like pull your return for audit. They send you something, they're saying, oh, you need to send us the receipts to substantiate these expenses. So absolutely, you need to keep that. There's tons of great apps out there. I don't have any off the top of my head to recommend, but there's tons of great apps where you can just take a picture of your receipt, file it away and keep yourself in good order.
There's definitely a lot of new technology that is helping out with that. It's just about developing habits so that people actually do it, but you've definitely got to keep those receipts. So what are some of the fears maybe that people have about tax and, being able to either do it themselves or have to hire somebody? I know when it comes to numbers, they're a little scary to me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I will tell you that I had a phone call a couple of months ago with the CEO of this company that, has definitely a few $1 million in revenue each year. And I could barely keep the guy on the phone with me simply because he was scared that I was going to tell him he couldn't do something he wanted to do. So I would say that's the biggest fear, that your business-wise, you're going to have something like all planned out. It makes sense. You take it to a tax person and they just like put the hammer down on it and say no way. And I would tell you that myself and I think most tax professionals, we want to find a way to get you to the business solution you want in the safest way possible, in a way that's not going to have the IRS knocking on your door or, the other side of your transaction person reporting something differently and causing an issue. But yeah, and then also, I mean, the words and the definitions are just kind of, they're complicated. There's, I mean, in the new qualified business deduction that we were talking about, there's so many. If you actually wrote, like, to figure out what your deduction is, right? Like how much you get to take from your income. If you wrote out the formula, it's like the worst, 8th grade math algebra formula you've ever seen. And so that's just kind of scary. So I think it's just important to have someone that you trust and that you can understand, like break those complicated things down for you.
Definitely. And like you say, all those words that if you're a lay person that you don't really understand what they mean can, strike the fear into people. So what are some of the side effects maybe of somebody trying to do the taxes themselves rather than hiring a tax attorney?
Well, I mean, a lot of times, if you're not familiar with maybe your deduction rules, you could deduct something that's maybe not fully deductible. If you should be depreciating it over a few years. Luckily, one of the positive business things in the new tax code is that there's a lot of assets that you can get a 100% deduction in the first year. So you basically get to expense it rather than depreciating it over a few years. But that kind of mischaracterization can happen. Also, gosh, let me think.
And what are the penalties for those kinds of things? If you do miscalculate something and it's way off, what kind of trouble are you going to get for doing that?
Well, if the IRS, generally they would have to catch it. And if they do catch it, then you would have to pay, of course, you'd have to pay the tax that's due and you would have to pay interest. And then you could also pay a penalty as well. So, and those vary in values, but generally penalties they try to only do penalties if you're like way off with your numbers. So if you're, a couple $100s off, you're just going to have to pay the tax and interest. But that tax bill might come at a time that you're not ready to pay it. You might not want a bill for $1,000 when maybe you just bought all this equipment for your business or something like that.
And of course, we're talking about tax time right now, when people are really thinking about getting all their numbers from last year and having their taxes paid. But is there an actual tax time, or should it be, throughout the whole year, putting things in place so when tax time comes around, it's a little bit easier?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, like you said earlier, it's all about developing good habits. Which I have a small kind of side hustle of my own, and I unfortunately don't even follow all of my my own advice in this circumstance. So you really should, as you go out throughout the year, like be moving everything over within an app that tracks everything, or a folder in your on your computer or in your email or things like that. And that way it's just really easy that you can do it at once. It'll still take you just a few hours, but do your taxes. So you're right. Tax time should be throughout the year. But, I think what ends up happening, and, what I'll be doing myself, is combing through my credit card, looking for those things that were really business expenses, and making sure then that I can find the documentation to support those. But yes, tax time throughout the year is definitely best practice.
So what are some perceived obstacles that businesses might have that would prevent them having a tax attorney, either whether it was in-house or just somebody to do their taxes at the end of the year?
I mean, the only perceived obstacle that I can really see is that obviously it's a business expense, just like anything else. And so if if you're trying to balance what you're doing, you might think, oh, I don't really need that. I can get by without it. The problem is, though, if you start down a path and maybe from a tax perspective, it's not right, then you've spent a lot of money and a lot of cost going down that path. And then it all has to be redone, because normally, like if you're working on a transaction, or even in this case, you're getting something ready for your accountant, and you haven't done it properly, then there's going to be redo of that work. So I always like to say that if you just bring in, if you bring in the person on the front end, you lay it out, it's usually much more cost efficient in the long run than it is trying to have them come in and fix it later.
And there's probably a time issue here as well. A local business person or a small business owner is going to be, running around doing all kinds of different jobs, and to think about stopping and spending time on taxes is, probably getting in the way of running their business. So does it help to have somebody lay out a plan? Is that something that you help them do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something we can definitely help people do. So, and that's actually what we like to do, is we like to help people not just in the times of crisis, but help them to say, okay, here's how we can manage the situation going forward. Here's a, best practice for, tracking your expenses, or, you need to just a timeline, kind of business organization. I mean, we've been doing this for a while, and we see how businesses run. We've been kind of embedded with businesses before, and we can really help you find good solutions, and find good practices to really make the most of your time.
So what would you say was the biggest mistake that businesses make when it comes to taxes?
Not filing your tax return.
That is the biggest one, is actually just not doing it, probably because it's too scary for them.
Right. Or some people, or they're just like, oh my gosh, I don't have the money to pay it. And you're like, okay, well that's fair, but they will come after you. I mean, right. In today's world, there's so much information reporting. So that goes to the IRS. If you're getting, not necessarily business, but if you're getting a 1099 from somebody and you haven't been paying your estimated tax payments, and that's your main source of income, right? Let's say you're an independent contractor. That's when you would get that form. You can't just not pay it. They will know, because the IRS is electronically sent that form, and they match it to see if they find yours on the other side. Mm-hmm. And they'll just know. So if you ever get a form and it has some income on it from anything, just make sure you know how that flows into your personal return, your business return. Just make sure you take care of your stuff, because you just don't. The IRS is one of those things that just doesn't go away, right? Death and taxes.
You just can't ignore the problem and hope that it disappears. It's going to show its ugly head sometime or other.
That's right.
So give me an example of somebody that you've worked with. Obviously, we don't need any names or anything like that, but tell us the situation that they were in, how they came to you, what problems they were dealing with, and how you were able to solve those problems and give them some peace of mind.
Okay, let's think about that. Give a good example. I mean, I was working with a JV with a company, and they were trying to enter into a JV, and there was all sorts of negotiations. So that's a joint venture, right? So where you have two companies who do something similar and they want to combine their interests, so they can get all sorts of economies of scale, so they can grow both of their businesses. And so in that situation, you have two parties. There's a big question of like, who's going to be, are they 50-50? Is it 51-49? Tax considerations and those things. What kind of, if companies contributing property with like, that's maybe where its fair value is worth more than its book value. You have some issues you have to look at. There are always issues where people are looking at who has the power to file the tax returns, especially when you have two businesses that are coming together like that. There are some elections that you can make that could be more beneficial to one party versus the other. Who, if the IRS does come, knocking on your door, which we hope never happens, but who gets to talk to the IRS about that problem? And so really just working through them and working through the transaction to work not only with your client, but with your opposing party to come up with a, not kind of only tax structure, but also a business structure that they can operate in and everybody can be happy about.
Well, there's definitely some complex issues there, and it helps to have somebody that knows the law and knows the situations and somebody that's handled it before, such as yourself. So let's talk a little bit more about you, Kim. What inspired you to become a tax attorney?
Oh, when I was, when I was a young teenager, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And I kind of picked that out of the air, and I've often questioned that decision, but generally I'm pretty happy with it. And then when I was in law school, I got an accounting degree for my undergrad. And then in law school, I saw they had a tax law class, and I just took it, and it just made sense to me. So a lot of laws, are based on kind of precedent, things that have come before. Like you definitely hear that whenever you hear about the Supreme Court and things like that. That's like a kind of law where you think of it just like a layer cake, that every decision that they make is layering on top of each other. And then you have to look at problems through the lens of that whole cake, But tax law is not so much like that. I mean, the Internal Revenue Code, as everybody has at least heard of, is an actual book. And then there's about, 4 or 5 times the amount of content after that that are actually regulations that explain the law. And for me, that just made a lot of sense. I mean, also, if you can understand the tax rules, then you just have a lot of control, I think, over where you want your business to go and the way that the world works. I mean, it's something you can't avoid. And it can touch a lot of things. You can also help people to avoid a lot of traps. And so those kind of things just really appealed to me.
Well, it's definitely a knowledge that if you have, you know all the benefits that you are open to, but if you don't have, there's also some pitfalls that you may find yourself in. So I'm glad that you did become a tax attorney and you're able to help people out because they certainly need it. So tell me about a lesson that you learned early on in your business that still impacts the way that you do business today.
You know what? I'm going to say don't make assumptions. Just because you see a client and just kind of from the base facts, you're like, okay, I know what kind of client this is. I know what bucket to put them in. normal partnerships with 50-50 partners, all sorts of things like that. That I really learned that don't make assumptions that is what they are, right? You always need to go through and do your diligence and ask to, look at the documents and have conversations with the client and make sure that you reiterate your understanding to them, and make sure that you're perceiving things in the correct way. I mean, I think that doesn't really just apply to, tax or anything like that, but really just for any business, is that once you start making assumptions, you really lose some of your power, and you lose some of your ability to solve their problem correctly, right? You have to make sure you really understand the problem in order to craft a really great solution.
So what's the most important thing a business owner that doesn't have a tax attorney and needs help, what should they be looking for when they're evaluating what tax attorney to go with?
I think a good team. To make sure that they have a good, generally other team around them. I mean, you want your tax attorney to work well with the corporate attorneys and with the real estate attorneys. You want to make sure they get along. And then probably the most important thing is to make sure that you understand them. Because if you don't understand what they're saying in the initial interview where you guys are barely talking taxes, then you're definitely not going to understand them down the road when you guys are actually trying to understand a complex topic.
So how can someone find out about Kim Wyatt and Exall Wood and how you can help them?
Yeah. Well, you guys can go to our website. So Exall, EXALL, Wood, WOOD.com. And you can definitely find me on there too. So my email is really simple, kwyatt, so KWYATT @exallwood.com.
Excellent. Well, Kim, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for giving us all this information about the new tax bill and some tax problems and pitfalls that we may fall into. It definitely seems like every business, whether large or small, needs a tax attorney to make sure that we don't fall foul of the IRS. So thanks for being our educator and our advocate today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Neil.
And to our listening audience, if you like what you hear, hit that like button and share, and we'll see you next time on the show.
You've been listening to Business Authority Radio with Neil Howe and Greg Williams. To learn more about the resources mentioned in today's show or to listen to past episodes, visit businessauthorityradio.com.